Hello, Adam here, and I want to talk to you about a subject that I find interesting. It's what I like to call the evolution of human rights in our society. I was having a conversation about a year ago with a friend of mine. We were discussing a modern political issue, which I won't get into here. And one of the things that he mentioned was this idea of his God given rights, which I found interesting because, of course, I've known that term my entire life, but it didn't really carry much weight until that conversation. And I had to think about it. Do we as humans have rights given to us by God, or is it something that we created for ourselves through some kind of social contract? What I can tell you as far as my biblical research is concerned, my reference, of course, is going to be the King James Version of the Bible, the Christian Bible, because much of my job is related to research and history of the Church of England. And when you talk about the Church of England, you have to take the King James Bible into account. So that's my reference for this particular subject. And what I could find was here and there little snippets about human rights, but mostly the most impactful thing is the fall of man in Genesis, where Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden for choosing basically what equated to free will versus obedience to God. You can get into the ins and outs of that, but this isn't a religious discussion. This is really more of a discussion of when did our idea of human rights start and what were the conditions that led up to it. Now, we as Americans often like to look back on our documents and think of that's where our rights started, but it goes much further back. And if you do your research and read back pre-Magna Carta, the earliest example that I could find was Cyrus the Great. Now, he was the king of Persia in ancient Mesopotamia. Specifically Babylon. We're talking about a pre-Islam society here. He won a great battle, became the king of Mesopotamia, what we now know as Mesopotamia, and he started releasing what we would know as propaganda. Now, I'm specifically speaking of an artifact known as the Cyrus cylinder, and if you have some spare time, you might want to read up on the Cyrus cylinder. It's very fascinating, and it has droves and droves of text on it about the accomplishments of King Cyrus. And it's basically propaganda. One of the things that it boasts about, and of course, this translation has been disputed over time, but it talks about the fact that he freed all of his slaves. Now, many of his slaves were Jews, and he gave those people the right to choose their own religion after their freedom, specifically the Hebrew religion or that pre-Islam society that they had. Specifically, he worshipped the god Marduk, so they had the option of worshiping in that way. So that's a very early example of individual freedoms being given to a people by a higher power. We can carry that over later on to ancient Greece and the fact that it's one of the very first democracies that you see. Specifically, they have an assembly that is formed of the citizens. Now, of course, you have to be a citizen, and what counts as being a citizen is in dispute, but the citizens would come together and they would vote on the council that would rule over them. This would carry on later on and bring us to those ideas being implemented in the Magna Carta. So, the Magna Carta Liberatum, or as it's translated, the Great Charter of Freedoms. There's that word freedom. Now, this is a charter that was, of course, drawn together to rein in the powers of King John of England, who had been fighting with several of his barons over a land that he thought he had rights to, specifically some of them in France, and them fighting over these lands. And so it was basically an agreement by King John of England and these barons to settle that dispute. it talked a lot about taking a lot of the power of King John away and giving it to the upper middle class at the time, which specifically was those barons. What we're dealing with here is a document that was drafted in 1215 for that purpose, specifically drafted by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. And the thing about it is neither side stuck to their agreement, and they just started fighting again. And it was basically annulled almost immediately by Pope the Innocent III. Now, after it's annulled, the fighting continues. King John I dies. And his son, the 9-year-old Henry III, is left on the throne. Now, once he's left on the throne, almost immediately after he takes his kingship, it is overturned and reinstated. So in 1216, you see the Magna Carta come back into play, and everything that goes with it is reinstated. Now, there's this little known and much debated theory that the reason it was reinstated was to reestablish rights for the proletariat that had been theoretically lost after the original ancient Constitution of England was abolished after the Norman invasion almost 200 years earlier in 1066. So let's talk about some opposition to this idea. Let's talk about the divine right of kings. Now, the divine right of kings is not exactly the opposite of human rights, but the divine right of king argues that the king's power is ordained by God. This is what you call a top-down system of government. In other words, the people who are most important, the king, the monarchs, the overlords, whoever, are in total control of the people underneath them. All right, top-down system of government. Now, social contracts like the Magna Carta, they assure that governments are created by society. Now, that's an example of a bottom-up system of government. In other words, the proletariat is the most powerful and has control over what the people above them do. Monarchs often oppose this idea, and they will use this idea of the divine right of kings, the fact that they're ordained by God, to justify overriding that bottom-up system of government or these social contracts that we've constructed. So in those cases, the divine right of kings is in direct opposition to the concept of a government empowering the people. And now in the 16th century, because of that, the divine right of kings comes under question. And a lot of that is due to the Church of England, its establishment of the Church of England, and the fight to keep the Catholic Church in power in England, or the Anglican Church in power in England, and the back and forth that happens throughout the centuries on that. So what I would call the revival of human rights doesn't come along until the 16th and 17th century. And you first start seeing it in writing with John Milton's writings. Now, he is the person that wrote Paradise Lost, if you're familiar with that. But one of the things he wrote was the tenure of kings and magistrates. John Locke's essay, the original extent and end of civil government, was influenced by that previous document. And these works would later influence people that you've heard about. Thomas Paine, who, of course, wrote Common Sense, and other people like George Mason and Thomas Jefferson, people that we're all familiar with. So now we finally get a chance to talk about 18th century history and how it's affected by this. And we get into the earliest part of that. I'm going to talk about the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Now, this is kicked off by things like the Sugar Act, which is really more of a revenue act. It was basically Britain's first attempt to get the colonists to pay what they considered their fair share of taxes. And the Stamp Act goes along with this, and some of the earliest ones that you see. And these are examples of taxes that were levied on the American colonies in the 18th century, where the profits were sent directly to the British Treasury rather than going through the local governments. This is once again an attempt to enforce that top-down system of government. And the natural reaction of the people, of course, is going to attempt to change that system to reflect that bottom-up system of government, empowering the proletariat. These acts, or acts being another way of saying laws, by themselves are not much of a concern by themselves individually, but since there's no representation of the colonies in Parliament, the colonists felt that they had no say in the matter. So Virginia in particular, they're going to take the lead on this. They're going to take action in the form of drafting the Virginia Declaration of Rights. 10 out of these particular articles were drafted by George Mason at 10 out of 16. And I want to read to you this one article in it. It's actually the first one, and it's going to sound a little bit familiar, but I think it's relatively important. So listen to this. It says that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Now, if you listen to that closely, you're going to hear many similarities between that article and the preamble of another document that we're familiar with, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which was released about 4 months later as well. And of course, if you read through the format of it, it's very much consistent with the format of the U.S. Bill of Rights. And of course, there's much of the same documentation in that as well. Now, of course, Jefferson and Madison are given the credit of being the leads on these. They didn't write them by themselves, but none of these people that wrote these documents were influenced by any one person. It's really more of an idea of government that places people as the deciders of their own fate. And that's something that has been around since the dawn of time, since man has existed. And we can see some of the earliest representations of that in our ancient history. And you will find similarities of these ideas echoed throughout time. It's something that has been around since the dawn of human existence. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for hearing my lecture. Have a great day.